Hello, everybody. It is Monday, May 17th. It is currently about 1:17 in the afternoon. I'm on a break from work currently, and I wanted to start off this reading vlog review for Stephen King's The Dark Tower, The Gunslinger. Now, for those of you that may be new, I have been reading Stephen King's works from his first published work all the way to his most recent publishing since about January of 2020. And I've been doing it now for about a year and a half. And as you will have seen from my other reading vlog reviews or sit-down reviews of his books, I try to talk about kind of the progression of his writing, and specifically when it comes to series that he has done that I will read essentially back to back until the series is done before moving to the next chronologically published work. I try to talk about the series in terms of the progression of it, how the writing has changed, how the plot has seemed to develop from book to book. So this is going to be starting off the Dark Tower series. Now, if you are new to Stephen King and don't know really anything about his writing or anything about it, The Dark Tower is basically what is considered his magnum opus to a lot of people. It is the series that has really shaped a lot of his career. It is arguably probably one of the most expansive series that there ever has been in any kind of genre, whether it's horror, westerns, fantasy, sci-fi, because this basically involves all of it. This entire series is an amalgamation of several different kinds of genres, and it is only one of the reasons why it is so expansive. The second reason why it's so expansive, because this series also then extends to several different standalone books that he has, as well as other series, because of very limited elements that are involved. So there's this kind of multiverse almost theory that kind of goes into the Dark Tower, where several of these standalone novels or even short story collections that Stephen King has written since the Dark Tower have inklings that reference things like the Man in Black or the Devil. One of the most prominent ones being The Stand, which The Stand was actually published before The Dark Tower, but there are theories that link this book up to The Dark Tower because of the fact that the main bad guy that is involved in The Stand is referenced as the Man in Black several times in that book, and the main antagonist of The Dark Tower, who's kind of this devil figure, is also called the Man in Black. Now, this particular edition I have is the movie tie-in that was made when the movie was released, which stars Idris Elba as our main character Roland, who is the gunslinger, and Matthew McConaughey as the Man in Black. To give a little bit of background about how this series basically started is that Stephen King was a huge fan of the epic The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. It was a massive love of his. He actually mentions in this particular edition there is a little beginning portion. It's not quite the preface, it's kind of just an introduction talking about how when he was 19 years old he was in love with Tolkien and he wanted to create something that was going to be as impactful to him as The Lord of the Rings was to him when it first came out, as well as The Hobbit. Now, King basically said he didn't want to just do a copycat of what Tolkien did. He wanted to create his own story, but he wanted to create a story that was just as epic, just as fleshed out, just as inspiring in terms of the magic system, the lore behind it, things of that nature. And honestly, I would have to say that just from my knowledge of the Dark Tower and where it has played into several other standalone books and series that King has created over the years, I would say he's probably come very close, if not already succeeding that aspect, just by this 7-book series that he created with the Dark Tower. Now, The Gunslinger is the shortest of the 7 books in this series, and yes, you heard me right, 7. There are 7 books, and like I said, there are other books that he has created over the years after this that also play into the Dark Tower. There's cameos, there's references to things that involve the Dark Tower, and none of them necessarily are one in the same as the Dark Tower, but they basically have inklings to it that get you basically to understand that it's all coming from kind of the same place, or it has some placement within the Dark Tower story, whether that is part of a different universe, it's part of a different kind of plot line that is involved with, say, the Man in Black, or with Roland, or with a character that, is reminiscent of somebody that we've already seen. Like, it could literally be anything. I would say if you would like a little bit more of a look as to how individual books that Stephen King has written that involve the Dark Tower, I would highly recommend going and researching that on your own. I don't know in particular which of these guys actually delved into how the Dark Tower flows into every Stephen King book that there is, if they do at all, but I will leave links to a couple of booktubers that I really like watching that have extensive knowledge on Stephen King because they've read several of his works and have read him for years, one of which is Edward Lorne. I really like him. He's actually one of the first guys that I remember finding on BookTube that was a massive Stephen King fan, that was really eloquent in talking about his experience with reading and rereading the books that King has written. And then I also have I don't remember what his channel name is now because it's changed over the couple years he's been on BookTube, but Library Funk, I think, is at one time what his name was, but either way, I'll leave his link in the description. Another really big Stephen King fan, somebody who I think specifically when it comes to talking about the Gunslinger and the Dark Tower series is very animated and very enthralled and engaged in the story that it makes you very excited to continue reading it. So would definitely recommend checking those guys out for a little bit more information about the Dark Tower in general because of how expansive it is. Currently, I am just started the first chapter. I did read the 2 add-in sections that were at the beginning of this, which were the introduction and another intro kind of piece. It was the foreword, which basically were both written in 2003 when an edition of the Dark Tower, the Gunslinger, was reprinted and was given a little bit more information in terms of King's thoughts at that current time. Now, this particular tie-in was made much later because, as I said, this is the movie tie-in that came out when the movie with Idris Elba and Matthew McConaughey had come out. Now, this particular edition does clock in with the main story being about 251 pages, along with the acknowledgments and other end page stuff and the foreword and introduction of the book. But still, about a 250 page book. As I said, it's the smallest of the Dark Tower books. The books actually do get much longer as time goes on. First of all, let me say that in terms of my thoughts of this is a reread for me. I listened to the audiobook of this a couple of years ago, and unfortunately at that time I think I was in a really weird slump with audiobooks, so I didn't really enjoy the story as much as I thought I would, mostly because I wasn't able to focus on the audiobook. And I'm not saying that has anything to do with the book itself, because as I said, I was kind of in a weird audiobook slump. I don't really know whether or not I was capable of focusing on any audiobook, let alone on The Gunslinger. So this is a reread for me, but I don't remember much of what happened from the first time I had listened to it, which is also why I decided to read it physically this time, because I figured that typically with Stephen King books, I do a little bit of a better job of understanding the story by reading it physically. So far, read the first part of the first chapter. Really wasn't much of anything except just kind of introducing the Gunslinger a little bit, just kind of talking about how he's going on this journey to find the Man in Black, but we don't really know much else. And one thing I really appreciate with Stephen King in general that I think I may have mentioned in other reading vlog reviews or sit-down reviews of his books is that each of the chapters that are involved in this are broken up. And I know it's a very unconventional kind of way of writing for a lot of people, but for me, I think with Stephen King, there's so much that he says within even just sometimes a very short span of time that sometimes breaking the chapters up into sections does make it a lot easier for people to kind of take a break in the middle of a chapter. Because for me specifically, when it comes to long chapters, if there's not a break in between the mass amount of pages of a chapter, I'm gonna feel pressure to finish that chapter before I take a break, because I don't want to basically miss anything. And I don't know why that's the way my brain works, but that's how it is. And so having a break in a chapter is always very nice because it gives me more opportunities to take a break and digest the information, whereas like a 20-page chapter will be so much information, and in order for me to feel satisfied with how things are going, I would need like little breaks to be able to make everything into kind of more bite-sized pieces for myself to understand the story. He doesn't do it in every single book, mind you, but the thing is that with King in general, he does try to do that because I think he knows that his chapters a lot of times are really expansive and they can drag on for a long time. So he almost gives you that ability to be able to take a bit of a break at some point in his chapter so that you're not having to read 30, 40 pages and then be like, I don't even know what I just read. I am going to go and finish up my break for work right now, and I will talk to all you guys when I have made some more progress in the Dark Tower and have some more thoughts that I can share with you. Okay, so it is a little bit later in the day. I have done a little bit more reading on this next break that I've been on, and I got a couple of minutes to be able to kind of just go over quickly what exactly we learn first off in this book. So I'm currently on page 19, and essentially the first opening scenes are that we see Roland, the gunslinger as he's called, basically traversing this wasteland area. It's very deserty, it's dry, it's hot, there's not really any relief for him and his poor mule who he is riding with. The mule is basically on its last legs, and it actually does die very quickly in the beginning of the story. So Roland, though, comes across this kind of just little hut, this little place he could stop for the night and rest, and he meets this very scraggly looking man named Brown, and Brown has a raven that is named Zoltan. Zoltan is what his name is. And Brown seems to be kind of odd. The book describes how most people, when you would walk across the wasteland, would either be like lepers or madmen, and the madmen were usually pretty crazy, like they would try to kill you, steal your stuff, you know, all that kind of jazz. So Roland's not really sure whether Brown is going to try to kill him or not, and he is also just very on edge because you learn very quickly early on he's just come from a place called Tull. He says that it was a town that he basically killed, and he's got this kind of almost guilty conscience, I would say, because he's very quick to open up to Brown about what's happened, but he's not sure as to why, because he thinks that Brown could possibly be the man in black in disguise. He has no idea. He has no clue who this man is, nor anything about him or where he is, and he's actually just trying to go after the man in black, basically. And according to Brown, the man in black had been there probably about 6 weeks ago at this point, where Roland's been traveling for about 3 weeks. And so, at least from Tull, that's the first like 4 parts of the first chapter. Going into part 5 is when he starts basically backtracking. Now, I do remember this book had basically been where we start kind of in media res, or basically in the middle of things, as the phrase is. It's basically where you start a book kind of just in the middle. You're plopped in the middle of something. You don't really know what. You have no indication of how things have gotten to this point. And a lot of times what authors will do is they will backtrack. They will have their character backtrack either by talking to somebody else about their adventures, or they recount it in a sense where they might start the first chapter kind of in the middle of things, and then it kind of pulls one of those really kind of like record scratch moments. I bet you're wondering how I got here kind of things. Like it could be something along those lines. Well, in this case, Roland decides to backtrack and talk to Brown about exactly what happened in this town of Tull. I actually think I like the writing of this a little bit more than I had expected reading it physically, because there are sometimes, especially with Stephen King's older books, that the writing is kind of hit or miss for me. I think it's more so his Richard Bachman books that are very hit or miss for me, because with like The Long Walk and I think The Running Man, the writing was just kind of weird. Like, it wasn't bad by any means, but it was just very complex almost, and not really so much lyrical as much as it was kind of nonsensical in some capacity. But a lot of, like, for The Long Walk in particular, there was a lot of references I didn't know because the book was so old and was playing on at that time 20-year references that only people who were reading it as like young adults or adults at that time, like in the 1980s, probably would have got, but I didn't know them. But this, despite how old it is, I like the writing of this better. I think in general, like I said, the Richard Bachman books are just not as good to me as his own published work, and I think that that's just because there was a huge stylistic difference that I didn't necessarily gel with when it came to when Stephen King was writing under the name Richard Bachman, which, for those of you that don't know, Richard Bachman was a pen name that Stephen King had used for about 5 years of his career in an attempt to push out more content that he had created, and unfortunately, due to apparently some similarity between books that King would write under his own name and the ones that he would write under Bachman, somehow somebody basically made the connection that they were the same person, and they outed him. So he only had the pen name for about 5 years before he had to kill off Richard Bachman, basically. It's a very interesting story if you are interested in looking it up. I'm really excited to see how this goes now that I can already tell from the first few parts of the first chapter that I'm already gelling with the style. I'm already getting clear images of how this is going. I think I'm going to really enjoy it at this time reading it physically as opposed to having listened to it the first time. I think I'm going to bump my star rating up depending on how much the book fares, because when I listened to it, it was a 3-star, but I'm already seeing that it's possible this could get bumped up to maybe a 4-star and possibly a 5-star depending on how the book goes over the course of the entirety of it. And again, hello everybody. It is Tuesday. It is now 11:34 in the morning, and I am about on page 50 of the Gunslinger. So what I've read in the last couple of pages, 20 pages or so, is that the Gunslinger, he comes into the town of Tull and he meets this guy. He goes into the saloon that's there, and this is where a lot of the Western ideas almost come in, as a very Western-based kind of town where it's kind of run down, old. There's saloons, there's people running around with horses and stuff like that. Anyway, when he gets into the saloon, he is approached by a man named Nort, who is kind of almost a zombie, not quite, and you learn about why he is the way he is by this woman Allie, who works in the bar that Roland ends up becoming kind of lovers with. Not really, he's not supposed to be there for a while, but he gets his kicks with her basically, and she tells him about how the man in black had come to this town weeks before, and essentially Nort had just died. He was a drug addict, and he had died of basically what was considered an overdose by eating a certain kind of weed. When Nort died, the man in black came to this town and started talking to Allie, and she was wondering, about kind of the idea of death, and because she was really sad. Nort was somebody she actually kind of cared about in some capacity, and so he brings Nort back to life, but he's not quite the same. He's kind of almost like a zombie kind of thing, and the man in black then leaves a note for Allie with it being signed Walter O'Dim, where he basically says, if you say this word to him, which the word is 19, if you say that, Nort will basically tell you everything about death and how it looks and everything, but it seems fairly ominous. It's not a good idea for her to say that. It could essentially spell pretty bad things. It's kind of the feeling. She doesn't know for sure, but it's kind of that idea of curiosity getting the best of us. So, as humans, we are notoriously curious and are notoriously apt to delving into things we probably shouldn't, because we want to know why things are how things are, and sometimes that can run us into trouble. There are plenty of movies and other books that have talked about this particular problem we have as humans. It's a very common thing. We get very prideful in ourselves in wanting to know information, and we become so curious to the point that we disregard the possible dangers associated with it. And I think that that's a huge theme that comes up, particularly in this kind of flashback. Now, Roland essentially tells Allie, after she's told him the story of the man in black being there, that she needs to, continue to not say this, because it could be really bad, considering that the man in black specifically told her this was the code word, essentially. Now he's trying to figure out whether he wants to go. We're still in the original flashback of being in Tull, and he's trying to figure out whether he needs to stay there for a little bit longer or essentially go, because he does know that if Allie doesn't have somebody there to hold her accountable of not saying this word that the man in black has told her to use, she will say it. And he's kind of, I think at this point, going to be trying to investigate a little bit more on what the man in black's purpose in this town was, other than possibly to bring destruction. I think he's trying to also pick up a trail of where he's gone, because Allie does mention that at one point in the desert where he's currently at when he's telling Brown this story, that in the desert toward the southeast, all of the clouds are moving toward that point, which I am assuming is where the Dark Tower is. It's somewhere in that southeast region where all those clouds are going, because that to me indicates kind of a power building kind of thing. Okay, it's now just after 1:30 in the afternoon, and I've made a little bit more progress so far today. I know I keep updating like quite often, but there's like a bunch of stuff that comes up that I think is really important for everybody to know as we're going through this. And these reading vlog reviews are spoiler filled as it is, because for this whole experience of reading Stephen King, I want to like talk about the books like in depth. So the only kind of interesting things that have happened since the last time I updated you, that basically one night before they go to bed, Allie and Roland get interrupted when they're about to have some sexy time by this man named Sheb, who Sheb is the guy I think who owns the bar or the saloon that Allie works in, and he comes in with a knife looking to kill Roland and Allie, saying that she was mine, all these things, basically going crazy. Roland breaks both of his wrists, and Sheb basically is just pissed because Allie's with Roland, who's new. He just rolled into town. He's been there for only a few days, and he seems to be taking everything that Sheb has ever actually wanted. Roland does start talking to Sheb, and somehow he's involved with Roland's past, like he's from the people that Roland knows from his past that were called the Medgies. What do you want? Do you want to get up here? I have a cat who wants attention, so she's gonna get some attention while being in this vlog with me. So this is Tala. This is one of my parents' cats. So anyway, basically, Sheb is linked somehow to Roland's past. Now, one of the things I don't really care so much for with this is that there's just such a lack. Oh goodness, nope, you're not doing that. Oh, stop it, you're fine. We basically just don't get a huge amount of backstory in terms of like anything to do with Roland's past yet. Now, this is because of the fact that we start literally in the middle of things, and we're kind of having to traverse our way through this story with almost no context of where Roland's from, who he knows, who he's involved with, anything like that. Why exactly Sheb being a part of the Medgies is really important, and the fact that he recognizes Roland from when he was a lot younger. There's so many things that I don't think works very well in terms of setting up the context, because like I said, just being in the middle of things sometimes can be, done well, where you don't necessarily need a lot of that context because it is sometimes provided for you and you can kind of piece things together as they go. But with this, for some reason, I feel like I'm just very lost in terms of like some of these interactions. The most important thing though is that the plot is still moving forward in a sense. Right now, Roland's kind of just stuck in a spot. He's not sure where he needs to go, what is his next step, and it does seem like this town has been vastly affected by the Man in Black, so I think he also kind of thinks he may have to save people or protect people that might have been influenced by him. But I don't quite understand some of these interactions he has with random people like Sheb, where he is like, there's some kind of connection to his past, but we don't really know what that is at all, and it's not really discussed. The only other thing that happened though too was Roland went and saw basically this woman who was named Sylvia Pitson. Sylvia Pitson apparently has been in this town for quite some time, and she's kind of our resident religious zealot, basically, where she apparently every Sunday night scares the entire town by saying that, they're all going to hell and they need to renounce themselves from the devil, or as she calls him, the interloper, which is another term that's very commonly used for a devil figure, especially in, I believe, just Christianity. I don't know if it's seen that way in other religious groups that have a devil kind of character involved. He talks to Allie about her, and she's like, you'll never see her. She only comes out every Sunday night to scare people. She does have this shack behind the church that she preaches at, but I don't really know what you want with her. She's not really that important to me. She's kind of just this crazy lady. I think, again, like I said, my main issue right now is like with certain interactions with characters throughout this book, because we start in the middle of things, there's not really a lot of description, not a lot of context in terms of exactly why Roland questions these certain people, why he's kind of trying to find out this information about where they're from, and specifically like how, in particular, Sheb, this guy he just, broke his wrists for trying to kill him and Allie, like he talks to him about this idea of like being from the Medji, and I don't know what the Medji is. I don't know what exactly is their purpose or what exactly they're supposed to do. He says to Sheb, he asks him about the girl named Susan and Reap Night. Was he there for the bonfire? Which I think that's another memory we're going to come across. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Susan was a character that Roland either cared for as like she was a child that he cared for, or a woman that he fell in love with at one point and she died. I don't remember for sure. I feel like that name comes up very reminiscently, because then later Allie asks about who was she, a girl you loved, and Sheb had basically gone into saying, but you was just a boy, one of them 3 boys, you can't come to Count Stock, and Eldred Jonas was there, the coffin hunter, and I don't know what any of this means, and I wish that we kind of would have got that context beforehand, but it's not something that is needed, I guess, at this time. I don't know. I feel like it's very disjointed. That's what I want to say. It feels very disjointed, and I'm not 100% sure if I like that. But it's gonna depend on exactly how much more I'm gonna get from the next several chapters. So hello. So it is now Thursday, or not Thursday. It is Friday. It is about 10:15 in the morning. It's been a couple days since I updated, and I did find my camera and charge my batteries and everything. So now we have a working camera. Okay, so I've just reached page 101. So like I said, it's been a couple of days. Haven't been able to really read much in the last couple of days because it's been kind of busy with work and other things going on in my life. But let me catch you guys up with what's basically been happening. So I think the last time I talked to you, we had basically found out that the lady that was in Tull that Roland was involved with, Allie, she had said that she shared her story about the man in black, that kind of stuff. So and then we started talking about the weird religious zealot that was in Tull, and Tala is trying to get my attention. Once again, every time I go to talk, she wants attention all the time. So yeah, so we met the religious zealot, and unfortunately, the only other thing that happened while in Tull during Roland's recounting of what happened was that, unfortunately, Allie did end up using the phrase or the word that the man in black had said not to, unless she wanted to know exactly what death was and all these things. So she said it, and when Roland goes back to the bar, he gets attacked by everybody, and what happens is pretty much everyone except Allie in that town becomes like a zombie. And they're all after Roland. The zealots involved in that, all this stuff. And basically, in order to kill everybody, he also had to kill Allie, because Allie was being basically like trapped by Sheb. He got a hold of her, and the only way for Roland to kill Sheb was to also then kill Allie. So everybody in Tull is now dead, and that is kind of how Roland ends up with Brown. And then he leaves Brown, saying that he's going to continue going after the man in black because of other things, meets up at this place called the Way Station. So we got through like the whole first chapter, and then the second chapter is this, like the second part of this. Well, it's not the only chapter, but the second part goes into chapter 2, which is about the Way Station. Now, the Way Station is basically like our stopping point for Roland, and he meets this kid named Jake, who also goes by Bama and all these other things. And what he learns about Jake, who is about 11 or 12 years old, is that Jake basically was left at the Way Station all by himself. And Jake has really no memory of how he got there, but he says he does remember being in like this large city beforehand. He doesn't remember much, but he remembers like the idea of cars, because in this world automobiles are not a thing. And also within this chapter you start to learn about how this world is set up, where it seems very post-apocalyptic. There seems to be some remnants of a former society with the way that money works, with the way that food is made, things like that. Like, it's very similar to what we would see in today's time, or at least when this was published in like the early 1980s. But there's no such thing as automobiles. Roland is not familiar with a lot of the things that are involved in this, and what that basically tells me is that in this world, like, it is very kind of Western sci-fi-ish and almost kind of fantasy, because it's almost like this other world. It's almost like this other dimension, parallel universe, whatever you want to call it, that is involved in the Dark Tower. And if you know anything about the Dark Tower, you know that this series basically deals with things like parallel universes, parallel dimensions, things of that nature. So it's no surprise that this world seems similar in a lot of ways, but it's much more apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic esque kind of feel. I wouldn't even say so much dystopian, because there's not really much of a society involved. All that we see at this point is just a bunch of desert and maybe one or two little spots here for shelter. So while he's with Jake, Roland basically finds out this thing that Jake does remember, which is that he had been going to school and he got hit by a car, basically, and the man in black had basically found him, and Jake thought he had died, but then he basically woke up and is in this world now. So there was some kind of parallel universe shift of some kind, and Jake has really no other memories other than that. And Jake also does not sleep very well because of what he remembers and what he does dream about. Roland has said that he is going to meet the man in black. Like, he's basically told Jake what exactly he's planning on doing, which is to go find the man in black, and he either is going to have the man in black tell him something, or have him lead him to this tower, which is the Dark Tower, which, again, if you know anything about it, the Dark Tower is basically this, like, center point of all these universes, all of these dimensions, and the whole point of it is that the tower is basically coming down. It is being destroyed. You start to understand throughout part of this too some of Roland's history, some of his background. He seems to also be from another world, whether it's a part of this one or if it is a completely different one, because basically the way he describes it is that there's a lot of sadness, there's a lot of kind of distress about where he comes from, likely because it might have been destroyed, and that's how he was able to go through to this world where he's at now, where the Dark Tower is. But we're not really clear on that. We're not sure if it actually is a part of this current world he's in or if it's a different one, but he does kind of talk about some of the people he was involved with, and it brings up some pretty painful memories for him. Because there are people that basically recognize the fact that he's not from this area, but they recognize in a sense like that he is from a particular area, whether of this world or another world or something like that. So there's not a real clear distinction with that as of yet, which I think it doesn't necessarily make it confusing, but it does make you wonder, like, how exactly is this world he's currently in set up? Is he a part of it and was just from another area, like, say, from another country of some kind, you know, something like that? Or is he come from a completely different universe, a different world entirely? Not necessarily alien, but just he's from, like, a different parallel universe of sorts. So, yeah, that's basically all we really know going into this currently. I'm now, according to Goodreads, over a third of the way through this. I'm almost like 40%, I think, which so far it's actually not that bad. I actually feel like I'm getting more from this now the second time, which was my thought when it came to reading this, because like I said, the audiobook, for some reason, I was not able to follow as well. I think that at the time I was very burned out on audiobooks, so it was very hard for me to get acquainted with it and really focus on it. And I also, at some points in my life, have had spurts where I can't focus on audiobooks in general, and it's just easier for me to read the physical copies. And so no surprise that the physical copy of this is making it a lot easier for me to grasp what's going on. And I think that the more too that I read Stephen King, the better I get a grasp on his writing a lot quicker. And I think that that also then helps me in a lot of ways, just because it makes it easier for me to get involved in the story, to pick out the things that are very interesting to me, to pick out the things that are either ties or are world building aspects that I'm able to better understand. I think that it's just become something kind of like a muscle memory of sorts, where like the more that you read him, the better you get at understanding the way he writes and how he writes it, and how exactly, especially in these kind of more fantasy sci-fi almost books, how these worlds are developed. And I think that that's very amazing because, you know, we've had a lot of books in the past that have been kind of in a modern setting, modern in terms of the time it was published, but had paranormal or supernatural elements like Firestarter, The Dead Zone, you know, all these other books that were otherwise based in kind of a normal setting. This is the first book we've seen that is actually kind of in a more fantasy sci-fi setting in terms of the world placement. So this was basically a whole new area for King to be writing in, and other books he's had in the past under Richard Bachman have been kind of dystopian based, because like The Long Walk and The Running Man, for instance, both of those are more of a dystopia, but it's otherwise kind of like what we would see the Earth possibly become. This is like truly the first time, though, we've seen a completely new world, not necessarily just dystopia, if that's possibly what this new world is, but something almost completely alien and different, or at least different parallel universes that are in place. If I remember correctly, Jake goes through something that's really, really awful throughout this book, but I don't remember what it is, and I was pleasantly surprised that I remembered so much about Tull, but I don't remember as much about what happens to Jake. So I'm excited to see kind of what happens with it, but I feel like whatever happens to him did break my heart the first time, and I have a distinct feeling it's going to happen again the second time. It's going to break my heart. So. Hello everybody, it is Saturday now. Again, it's been a couple of days since I've updated you. I have just now reached page 150 of The Gunslinger. So what has happened in the last about 50 pages or so is, let me see if I can tell you. So what we first learn, obviously, is that Jake is going to be going with Roland. We know he's already basically been told he's going to go with Roland, and they're going to go try to find the Dark Tower. Jake is very obviously nervous about a lot of this. He doesn't really know what to expect in terms of what's going to be going on from here on out. And the way that he kind of acts is if, like, he seems to be like a really knowledgeable kid. It's just the thing is that he doesn't quite fit in with this whole world, because he talks about having been from some other world, and Roland has really no idea what any of that means. Several of the parts of this way station section is basically going back in time, learning a little bit about Roland's past, and specifically with like how he had come across this knowledge that was really treacherous. There was basically this group of people who were committing this really awful act in his world, which kind of sets things up essentially for what he knows about the Dark Tower, and I think it has something to do with the Man in Black, but we don't know for sure. And he talks to his father about these things that are happening, and you know, his father's kind of like, you know, you're too young to deal with this. Like, this is not something you need to be a part of right now. And like, I'm not going to tell you more than you really need to know at this point, because I think that the way that this is supposed to be written, at least this flashback, is that Roland's probably like a younger teenager, because he doesn't seem like a full-on child. Like, he's able to understand certain things, but his demeanor kind of reminds me of a younger teenager, or maybe he's like, you know, 14, 15 years old. He's a young man. He's not really like super knowledgeable about the world, but he is understanding like some morality things that are right versus wrong, that kind of thing. One other thing is that it talks a lot about his friend Cuthbert, who we've already kind of been hearing quite a bit about. One of his best friends growing up was this person named Cuthbert, who was another gunslinger in training. Cuthbert was kind of this kid who, like, he was not necessarily like distractible, but like the first scene you see him and Roland with in this entire flashback section is Cuthbert, you know, obviously not paying attention to what he's supposed to do, and he gets reprimanded for it by their instructor pretty awfully. We find out specifically who actually was causing these treasonous acts, and there's a scene where there is a public hanging. So then in part 13 of this second chapter, basically, we go back to the more present time, which is with Jake and with Roland. And this is ending actually the second chapter in general. This second chapter ends basically where the two of them start to actually leave the way station that Jake was found at, and they are heading toward the Dark Tower, and Roland is kind of like basically understanding that this boy might not, you know, make it the whole way. He seems to not really be doing well because obviously he's been having trouble sleeping. He has these really strange dreams. Roland kind of gets the idea that Jake is basically weak and he may not make the whole journey, but he has this like overwhelming love for him that he can't quite understand, but he thinks it may have something to do with the fact that it's possible that the Dark Man, or the Man in Black, that he has kind of set Jake up as kind of like a trap for him, as a way for the Man in Black to basically use him as leverage over something, and he's not quite 100% sure what that is. But, you know, he continues to take care of Jake because he does care about him. Then we move into chapter 3 and part 3, which is called The Oracle in the Mountains. So we move on to the third section of this book with chapter 3 called The Oracle in the Mountains. We basically start off where Roland and Jake find a place to stop for some time, whether it's a night or a couple days. Like, they basically find a spot after having traveled for some time. Jake is getting worried. He's not sure what the Man in Black is up to, all these things, and then they fall asleep. And the second part is there is a dream that Roland starts to have involving a woman named Susan Delgado. And Susan, we learn, was some kind of a lover of Roland's, some kind of wife or girlfriend or something like that. He cared deeply for her. He was in love with her. They were together. And the scene is basically where Susan is dying. She's basically being burned alive and he can't stop it. And there is something to do with Jake involved because Susan keeps calling the boy, Roland, the boy. And Roland sees Jake, essentially his image in this dream. And when he wakes up, unfortunately, Jake has basically been sleepwalking, and he finds out that Jake is being somehow kind of like almost possessed by the Man in Black. There's some kind of really disturbing aspect of what is happening to Jake. He's some kind of a conduit, which is why why Roland has had suspicions about the Man in Black using him as a bit of a trap. So the way that though he is able to get Jake to actually wake up and remove this power over him is by using this jawbone he finds partway through. Actually, I think while he is with Jake at the way station, they go into the cellar and he finds this jawbone and he understands it has very significant power, but he doesn't know what. But he pulls out the jawbone and it is actually able to pull Jake out of this really strange reverie that he is in. And when Jake wakes up, he doesn't know what's happened. He doesn't know what's been going on. But Roland immediately is like, I gotta protect this kid even more than I already was going to. So then Jake wakes up and he's like, why did you tie me up? You know, I wasn't gonna run away. Roland explains to him that he did, and he was having some kind of really strange aspect about him, like whether he was being possessed or not. And Roland decides that he needs to get some extra information from somebody, which means he has to obtain the information from a oracle. Now, if you don't know what an oracle is, oracles are vastly known in especially like Greek mythology, and other traditions as well. I think that there's other versions of oracles within various traditions that you can look up in terms of story. Not fortune tellers, but they're seers. They are able to tell how things are going to happen in the future if one goes on a particular path, that kind of a thing. So the way that Roland, though, accesses this oracle is a way that apparently in his world, in his culture, it's been known how to access it, because apparently gunslingers are able to use this from time to time, at least in his culture, and that is essentially by being in a drug-induced state. He has what's called a mescal, which I don't know. I feel like for some reason that is a name that is associated with LSD, because Jake says that it sounds like LSD, but he doesn't know why he knows that. He just thinks that it might have something to do from his life that he originally had. But Roland's like, I don't know what that is. I don't know if it's actually the same thing, but I have a really distinct feeling, and I'm going to look it up and let you guys know in a note here in this video whether or not they're the same thing. But it's called mescal, and essentially the way that Roland gets Jake to go along with this is that he's like, I'm gonna stay here, but I'm gonna be basically zonked out, so you're gonna stay tied up, you're gonna stay there, don't run, don't stray, and if you start feeling funny, grab the jawbone. And there's this whole thing too where Jake in general is terrified of the jawbone, and I think it's because of this latent power he has within him that may have to do with the Man in Black. And this jawbone is basically like a grounding tether for him. It's what's going to keep him from being able to go completely berserk. So Roland then basically takes the drug, he falls asleep, he essentially has this vision of going to the Oracle, and the Oracle is very sexual. She wants basically a sexual encounter in order to get any kind of truth from her. And she says a lot of things in order for Roland to give her what she wants. So first thing is that the number 3 is the number of Roland's fate. She says 3 is mystic, which if you know anything about anything with stories or anything, the number 3 is a very, very well-known number of importance. Like, I think Shakespeare was one who typically used the number 3 when it came to a lot of his works. And the thought is that everything comes in threes, and like 3-act plays, you know, stuff like that. There's always like 3 parts to a story. Oracle basically talks about how there's like 3 doors that Roland is going to have to find, which all will help him lead him to the Dark Tower. She also said that there is 3 parts. 3 stands at the heart of your quest. Another number comes later. Now the number is 3. We see in part, and thus is the mirror of prophecy darkened. So the prophecy essentially has 3 parts to it. The first is young, dark-haired. He stands on the brink of robbery and murder. A demon has infested him. The name of the demon is heroin, which heroin is a really nasty drug to deal with. If you know anything about how heroin essentially affects people, it is one of the hardest drugs to become sober from. And Roland says that he doesn't know what heroin is. He has no idea what this is because it's not part of his world. The Oracle says, we see in part, and thus is the mirror of prophecy darkened. There are other worlds, Gunslinger, and other demons. These waters are deep. Watch for the doorways. Watch for the roses and the unfound doorways. So that basically, she says, like, there's other worlds you don't know about. You already kind of know this, but, you know, you have to find the doorways to these other worlds because they're basically going to, you know, help you. She says that the second prophecy is that a woman, she comes on wheels. I see no more. So there's some kind of woman involved that we don't know of as of yet, but she comes on wheels, whether that's by car, train, some kind of automobile possibly that's on wheels is what I'm assuming, which I think is going to have to do with something that he's going to have to experience in another world. That's my theory, because I've not read the rest of the series. I don't know yet what's going on with it. The third prophecy is, she says, death, but not for you, you meaning Roland. And he asks if it's the Man in Black. Where is he? He's near. You will speak with him soon. Of what will we speak? The tower. And then he wants to know about Jake. What is Jake's role in all of this? She says that the boy is your gate to the Man in Black. The Man in Black is your gate to the 3. The 3 are your way to the Dark Tower. So basically she's saying that Jake is the way, Jake is going to be the reason why he's going to find the doors. The doors are going to lead him essentially to the Dark Tower. So therefore, Jake is going to lead him to the Dark Tower in some sense. And so we already kind of knew this going in, that Jake was going to be a really important part of this entire story, but we just didn't know as of yet how. And so this Oracle is basically telling us that Jake is going to be the real reason as to why Roland's going to get to the Dark Tower. And so he wants to know exactly how he can spare Jake, because he thinks that by doing this, Jake is going to have to be sacrificed in some way, whether that, you know, he has to be killed or taken somewhere, and Roland's not going to be able to protect him for long. And so he's worried that this is going to hurt him just as much as when he lost his woman Susan so long ago. And then the Oracle basically doesn't say anymore. She basically just is like, hey, give me what I want and let's be done with this, because there's nothing else I can tell you. The only thing that I want to talk about other than what I've already said is what's been going on is I actually feel like, again, I'm really liking this. I know I've said it before, but I feel like I'm getting a much better grasp of what this story is. I have a really good feeling that this is going to end up being at a 4-star, and it's gonna basically be one of my more favorites, I think, because of the fact that I think that this is such a strong start to a series with even as short as it is. So I have about 100 pages of this left. I'm on page 151. I have also a distinct feeling, here's one theory I will say, I have a distinct feeling that we are going to meet somebody who is going to remind Roland a lot about Susan, because he said about Jake that Jake reminds him of kind of as Cuthbert, but then he also said that he reminds him of this other man that he knew, Alan, or Elaine, and it's very possible that because of that, we're going to find more people in these other worlds specifically that Roland's are going to be like, I thought this person was dead, they actually are dead, this is just a whole other person from another world that just is very reminiscent of that person. I also have a feeling that we're going to see more of Roland's past in this one, in terms of specific scenes leading up to why he is obsessed with finding the Man in Black, because apparently the Man in Black has some dealing with how Roland's life got turned upside down. So I'm curious to see how much more we see of it before the end of this, because... Hello everyone, so it is Sunday evening. It is, I think, I want to say after 9 o'clock, I don't know. Anyway, I have reached the 200-page mark of the Gunslinger. Last couple of days, I wasn't really in the mood to reading. Yesterday, I wasn't feeling super great all day. I just was in a lot of pain and was not in the best reading space. Okay, this might be a good spot for me to put you. So, yeah, so he basically goes and leaves the Oracle. Then he finally wakes up from the trip he's had, and he talks to Jake for a little while. And then after that, they pick up and leave and start climbing this mountain that, it's like this mountain range area. It's another kind of point of their journey. It's where they are heading toward the Dark Tower, and they get through quite a bit of it. And Jake starts asking a lot of questions. He starts asking a lot of things about why he's here, what exactly does the Man in Black, want from him. Starts to also ask the Gunslinger a little bit about his life, where he grew up, stuff like that, because Jake understands that he's not really part of this current world, and I think he starts to understand that Roland is not either. There's a lot of things that Jake says that Roland doesn't quite understand, so he knows at the very least that Jake and Roland are not from the same world, and I think that he also understands that Roland is not necessarily a part of this world that they're living in currently. So he starts talking a little bit about how he grew up, and then they start talking about how essentially the journey through the mountains takes a long time. He says that Jake's hair has gotten longer, and it's curling a little bit, so obviously they've been traveling for quite some time through these mountains, and it's kind of hard because the mountains, the further you get, any mountain range you see, the higher you get, the higher the altitude, and then therefore the lower the temperatures get. Typically with mountains, you'll see some kind of snow, ice, something like that, because the temperature is a lot colder there, so water freezes at a quicker rate. And then they talk about how they eventually do see the Man in Black, and the Man in Black basically does say that he and Roland will discuss things at a later point of why exactly they're coming together. He says, we'll speak on the other side, I think. On the other side, we will hold much counsel and long palaver, just the two of us, indicating that Jake is somehow either going to be dead by the time that they get to the other side of these mountains, or something's going to happen to him at the least. And so then Jake basically gets the option to either continue with Roland or to be left behind, and Jake decides to go with him. And so then we get into part 4, which is the Slow Mutants. Now, the Slow Mutants, from what I've seen so far of it, because I'm now heavily into this part of the book, is that we get a lot more about Roland, specifically about some very specific incidents, some very specific things that he, talks about growing up. He talks about at one point a cotillion that they used to have when he was younger, and there is an entire several sections of him actually defeating and telling the story of him defeating his teacher Court, and basically this coming of age battle where essentially he's not the only one that goes through it. Several young men go through this trial where they have to essentially defeat and sometimes ultimately end up killing their own teachers, and it's a test of strength, it's a test of will, and it's a test of essentially, are they skilled enough to finish off their teachers, basically. So starting off the entire chapter, chapter 4, Roland starts to talk about, I think the cotillion is what he's basically talking about. Yeah, the sowing night cotillion. The Kamala, some of the older folk called it after the word for rice. It was held once a year in the Great Hall. The proper name was the Hall of Grandfathers, but to us it was only the Great Hall. And he talks about, stuff that happened there, and he also talks a little bit about his family, like how, like, his mother and I think his father had met at that cotillion years and years and years before. Roland talks a little bit about, what his mother and father did when they were at this cotillion, when they were younger. There's a guy named Martin who I think is one of the other adults in Roland's life. I don't remember. I feel like at this point, like, I think at several points in the story, I've kind of lost track of who's who. So that's one thing I will say is very strange, is that, like, especially the spacing out of points of Roland's backstory coming in. I think I've lost a lot of the who's who in terms of Roland's past. It's just because it's so spaced out from point to point of when we start learning about Roland that I think that, you start to kind of forget a little bit about who everybody is. Then from there, basically, we start talking about a little bit about how the journey that Jake and Roland are on, it starts to become very monotonous. The only thing that they really have as any kind of other company is this river that's off to their right. But Roland believes that there's something wrong with it, like there's something that could be inside the water. Either it's done by the man in black to entice him to go there and then also somehow get trapped in there or whatever. But he basically tells Jake not to use the water, don't put his feet in the water, don't do anything. They find this railroad, and I think this is after they've come off of the mountain at some point, but there's this railroad that they find that Roland's not necessarily familiar with 100%. Like, he understands, like, it's basically a mode of transportation, but Jake obviously is more familiar with what this is. And then they find this hand car where Jake is like, this is actually something we can use. We need to be able to, like, push on it, and basically it'll help us with moving down the track a little bit quicker. And at first, Roland's a little hesitant to use it. He's not really certain if it's a good idea, but then he starts to kind of use it himself, and it's not too bad. So they start to use it a little bit, and then they end up finding a place to rest. And Roland goes into, again, talking about his coming of age battle that I was talking about earlier with Court. So basically, it's leading up to the whole thing, him talking to Court about wanting to fight him, and then ultimately bringing down his teacher with only the hawk that his friend Cuthbert had been training David. He only uses that's his only weapon against Court, and this stick that he has that's got like a spiked side, and like I think it's some kind of a, like, not spatula, like, let me see how they describe it. An ironwood stick, sharp on one end, heavily blunted and spatulate on the other. So yeah, it's kind of like a flatter surface on the other side. So yeah, he basically fights him, defeats him, and Court then basically starts talking to him about how, in order for him to kind of, some final advice from his teacher before he dies is to let people, like, let the news of what he's done spread. Let that spread before he goes and does anything else, because that's going to help him more with being a gunslinger, I guess. And his reputation will precede him, basically, is the idea. And then that's pretty much it for that. We just see him go off and celebrate his coming of age ceremony, all these things. And what I can see from the next part of this chapter is that, we go back to to Roland talking to Jake about it. So yeah, we have less than 50 pages left of this. We have one more, after this we have one more part. So there's 5 parts, which is 5 chapters with several parts to each chapter. Okay, so we have now finished the Gunslinger. So what has happened in the last 50 pages? Let's start from the top of it. So first of all, we come to essentially the end of Roland telling Jake about his battle with his teacher, Court, and essentially they go to sleep. Next set of days basically that they're walking and traveling with the handcart down the railroad tracks, they come across the slow mutants. And the slow mutants are basically these like zombie-like creatures, and they don't know where they came from. They're just very creepy, and they're basically just monsters. So they go through and fight them basically, and Jake is trying to keep up with Roland as he's doing his fighting, and they're still traveling along the railroad, and it's becoming very hard for Jake to keep up. So then they end up going through this tunnel, this like cave area for about 4 days, and then they come out the other end of it and find that there is this bridge that goes across this really big chasm, like huge, like it's probably miles long. And unfortunately, the bridge is not really stable, so they can't take the hand cart with them. So they have to walk across the bridge. And unfortunately for Jake, he does not get across the bridge. Fortunately, as Roland and Jake are moving across, the bridge is collapsing, and they also see that the man in black is there waiting for them at the edge. And unfortunately, because we already know he more than likely was going to die at some point, because of the fact the man in black had said that only Roland was going to be meeting with the man in black after he had done his journey, Jake does end up dying. He ends up basically falling to his death, supposedly. We don't necessarily know if he does die. We just know that, at least during the story, what happens is that he falls into the chasm. Now, I don't know if that necessarily means he's dead, but he's obviously gone at this point. Then we move into the final part of the book, which is called The Gunslinger and the Man in Black, which basically is an entire section of the book. The last, 25 pages, basically, is the Gunslinger and the Man in Black. They travel together, they find a place to sit and rest, and essentially what happens then is the Man in Black starts shuffling tarot cards. Now, if you know anything about tarot cards were used and are still used today as a way of asking questions about the universe. In a sense, some form of a fortune-telling method. Now, it's not always 100% accurate. More often, what my experience has been with having done tarot card readings now for the last probably about 6 months is that it doesn't necessarily tell me the future exactly. It just gives me an idea of what exactly is possible, what is going to be some coming energy, what to kind of expect, or more specifically, how am I currently feeling in this moment, and what am I expected to know about this coming moment kind of thing. However, what happens with the Man in Black is he has the standard deck, which would be considered the Rider-Waite deck, and then he also has other cards that are involved that are of his own creation. And essentially what this spread he does, which is 7 cards, essentially outlines the entire journey of Roland, which starts off with the Hanged Man. And the Hanged Man in this story is being used as, hey, this is Roland, signifies strength. You, the Gunslinger, are the Hanged Man plodding ever onward towards your goal over the pits of Na'ar. You've already dropped one co-traveler into that pit, which meaning Jake. Other cards basically start talking about kind of the things that are coming along the journey, and unfortunately what happens is the Man in Black at one point even says that he doesn't exactly know how the journey ends, and you start to kind of see this whole thing fall apart because the Man in Black then also essentially admits that he really has no idea what to expect. He has no idea how this whole thing is going to pan out. He just kind of hopes that Roland is not going to go through with going to the tower. Then Roland has this kind of dream, vision, something like that, of essentially the universe, and he doesn't quite understand what it is because basically it just becomes lighter and lighter and lighter, and then it's almost like it explodes. And when he wakes up from this thing, the Man in Black asks about the tower, and he asks about this vision that the Gunslinger has, and he basically tells Roland that he can't have the tower. It's not something he can just take. He even goes into talking about how essentially the tower is going to kill him. He's actually, in a sense, trying to warn him to not go to the tower because he needs to work on himself. Roland has a lot of things in his past that he needs to come to grips with and needs to come to accept before he can even try to attempt going to the tower, because the tower by itself is just gonna freaking kill him. It's gonna just destroy him basically, because it is an obsession. So there's this whole idea, I think, that's being brought into the story about obsession and about obsessing over something that you essentially want revenge on, for instance. And the tower seems to be this thing that Roland is really seeking revenge on. And then the Man in Black begins to talk about how exactly he's been kind of setting this whole thing up for Roland ever since Roland was a child, where he was Martin, who I think must have had some kind of affair with Roland's mother. That's the kind of thing I've been picking up over this book, is that Martin had some kind of affair with Roland's mom. And then the Man in Black also says that he was also the embodiment of a man called Walter O'Dim, who was another person that was somewhere in Roland's life. What he goes into then is that the vision that Roland has is likely the answer he's looking for, and how the tower is not going to do anything but bring him pain and bring him misery, because essentially the tower is only an infinitesimal part of what this world is and what the universe is. And he goes into this whole philosophical speech basically about how the universe is like really like this whole thing on a pinhead. Like, he talks about how, you know, Roland's vision of being on a blade of grass, and that would be the entire universe, is essentially what the universe is that there's all of these things, all of these galaxies, all of these worlds kind of all jam-packed together on this something that could be as small as a blade of grass. And we really don't know, because we do not have the capability to venture out into the universe like that. There is no physical way for us to be able to expand our consciousness so wide that we are able to fully encapsulate the entirety of the universe, however large or small that may be. And then we go into talking about who exactly the Man in Black works for, because Roland starts to ask who might have actually been able to see the full scope of this universe, and he says maybe God has dared, or the king you spoke of, or is the room empty, seer? So meaning, like, is there nobody actually there that is able to see this entire universe kind of idea? And the Man in Black admits that he doesn't know. He's never even met the person that he supposedly works for. Him even trying to find out is terrifying, because he could, you know, there could be consequences in terms of that. So what the Man in Black then does tell him is that, you know, he's never seen the king that he works for, but before you meet him, you must first meet the ageless stranger. You must slay him, Gunslinger. Yet I think it is not what you wish to ask. And he goes on this whole thing of, like, answering questions the Gunslinger's asking, but he's like, yeah, that's not really the question you want to ask, but I'll answer this one because it is important. So he goes through this whole thing of how Roland has to now basically go through this whole journey. He pretty much maps out part of his journey for him. And he talks about the king and master saying, he comes to me in dreams. As a stripling he came to me when I lived, poor and unknown in a far land. A sheep of centuries ago he imbued me with my duty and promised me my reward, although there were many errands in my youth and the days of my manhood before my apotheosis. You are that apotheosis, Gunslinger. You are my climax. So basically, Roland is the reason he exists. He is supposed to be the one that guides Roland towards this destiny, this thing he needs to do. But he does give a name, and the name of the king is Legion. Basically, this person is even by themselves a minion of the tower. They are someone who is so powerful, but they are still not more powerful than the tower itself. And what the Man in Black then says is that Roland has to find this ageless stranger in order to continue with his journey. He has to start west, go to the sea, where the world ends is where you must begin. There was a man who gave you advice, the man you bested so long ago, which was Court, his teacher. The advice that Court had given him, but when he bested him, was to wait. The Man in Black says, it was bad advice, for even then my plans against your father had proceeded. He sent you away, and when you returned, obviously things had kicked off where they did, where apparently after Roland had left and came back, something devastating happened, and it was specifically a plight against Roland's father, which we don't really know much about as of yet, or I didn't catch. I could have missed something entirely. He says, when you returned, Martin had gone west to join the rebels, so all said anyway, and so you believed. Yet he and a certain witch left you a trap and you fell into it. Good boy. And although Martin was long gone by then, there was a man who sometimes made you think of him, was there not? A man who affected the dress of a monk and the shaven head of a penitent, which was Walter O'Dim. So basically he was admitting that not only was he Martin, but he was also Walter for a time. And then he finally warns him once again to not go for the tower and do something different. Then he says, You must understand the tower has always been, and there have always been boys who know of it and lust for it, more than power or riches or women. The only other thing he says about the tower is that Roland has to obtain this power of drawing, which, if you know anything about how the series goes, the second book is called The Drawing of Three. And this is actually something that the Gunslinger now remembers as being part of what the Oracle said earlier, which was that the Oracle said that he has to come across 3 doorways to other worlds, which essentially to me means that he has to draw these doors. He has to essentially bring them to him in a sense. And so then basically from there, the man in black disappears. Roland awakes, and he's at least 10 years older than he was when he went to sleep, when he was having the vision and stuff that he was having with the man in black. And then he goes over to the end of the land, and we know that this is where he really starts his journey. That is the last 50 pages of The Gunslinger. So what are my overall thoughts on this? Now, I liked this, I think, like I said, a lot more than I had originally liked it when I listened to the audiobook. I think that the audiobook, at the time I listened to it, I was very lost the whole time. I felt that I wasn't really getting into the story, but at the time I was listening to it, I was also having a hard time just in general focusing on audiobooks. So that was probably my biggest problem at the time. The one thing I will say is I think that this is, like I said earlier, going to only be a 4-star because I feel like this was just structured so strangely, and I almost wish that we would have got the story from the very beginning, but I understand too that this is just the way that Stephen King writes. He's never really been an author up to this point to write in a chronological standpoint. Almost every book that we have read up to this point has been some form of having to backtrack and having to look at flashback scenes. It's very rare we find books, at least up until this point, that are chronological. For instance, the only ones I can think of are The Running Man, The Long Walk, Firestarter, maybe, The Dead Zone. Like, out of all the books he's written in the course of his lifetime up to the Gunslinger, it's not very many. You find more of his books are written in a way that either involves backtracking or split timelines where you have to kind of read one chapter in one timeline, one chapter in another. It's not often in terms of his catalog up to this point that you find anything that's chronological. And if there are books that are chronological, it's for a very specific purpose because they don't have as many paranormal sci-fi aspects. But because this is a book that deals so much also with parallel universes, it almost makes sense to have the story as weirdly structured as it is, because you're not only having to follow Roland as he's going on this journey, but he's retelling his story to certain kinds of people, and you're also having to understand aspects of his life as they come up through dreams, through visions, through, various things that just kind of seem to come up, conversations that come up that involve a backtracking of sorts. Now, that is, I think, kind of the issue, though, is that I feel like with all of that, I almost wish that we just would have gotten the story from the very beginning. I do know that there is a novel, though, that comes between books 4 and 5 of the Dark Tower series that basically is an entire prequel, almost. I think it's supposed to be a prequel. It's called The Wind Through the Keyhole. As far as I know, that's a prequel to even The Gunslinger. Like, it's basically looking at Roland in an earlier part of his life. Basically, I feel like this was a really good start, but I feel like, personally, the way that it's structured is not my favorite. It's not the way I like stories to be told in general, regardless of Stephen King's writing. But I have had issues in the past where, with Stephen King doing this backtracking kind of idea, sometimes things can get lost. And as I said earlier, I feel like there were points that I did just completely forget who people were in terms of looking at the pieces of Roland's past, because the amount of time we had with Roland in his past was kind of spread out so far between points of contact with the past that it almost made it hard for me to really be able to remember who was who, except for Cuthbert, Roland as a young man, and Court. Other characters that were involved, I don't really remember as well. But now we know that the Man in Black not only was Martin, but was Walter O'Dim in points of Roland's life they were very influential in some capacity. So just in general, like, those flashback scenes were really hard to really differentiate between some characters, but it wasn't so awful to where I felt like I was completely lost. I just didn't quite fully connect everything, which is why I feel like I can't give this a 5-star, but I actually did really like it. I really liked this on the second run, and I'm really happy that I liked it as much as I did, because I'm very invested now in understanding what is to happen with the rest of this series. I'd like to know, especially because now the Man in Black is not really, he might be a part of this whole thing still, but as far as I know, with the Gunslinger, he's gone. He's not supposed to be here for a while. My part is done now. The chain is still in your hands where it doesn't wrap itself around your neck. And the only thing you see of him is basically a skeleton with his robes around him still. So either he's dead or he's just completely disappeared and we're not going to see him for any amount of time. Yeah, so that is my thoughts on the Gunslinger. Like I said, about 4 stars. Really liked it. Has some issues in terms of structure and the flashback points here and there, but not too awful. Really enjoyed it the second time around. Definitely would recommend reading it physically, but that's based off of my biased experience because, like I said, the audiobook, I was not in the right headspace to listen to audiobooks in general, but I found that reading it physically was very enjoyable for me. Thank you all so much for joining me in this video. I will be doing more videos reading the rest of the Dark Tower series. I do individual reading vlog reviews basically of all of Stephen King's work. I have a playlist of the rest of the books I have read up to this point in chronological order in terms of publication, with series being read back to back to back. So if you would like to watch more videos of me talking about Stephen King's books from his first published novel to his most recent, I would definitely check out that playlist. But yeah, so thank you so much for joining me, and if you guys did enjoy this video in particular, please do give this video a big thumbs up. If you haven't already and you'd like to be, hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye, guys.